Hi, in this first playlist we'll talk about the code that you write to set up Direct3D. There is actually quite a lot of boilerplate initialization code that you have to write to get Direct3D set up and spun up, ready for you to start rendering 3D stuff onto the screen. In Visual Studio, if you create a new DirectX project, you'll see in there all the boilerplate code that I'll talk about in this series of videos. In my own code, I use slightly different names from the ones they use in the project template. I'll show you what I mean. So this is the project template. So they use a naming pattern in places anyway, along the lines of create some kind of resources and then release some kind of resources. So and here by resources, what they mean is, I think what they mean is like the C++ sense of that. So like resource acquisition and release. You know, you acquire a resource, you have to make sure that you free it and release it at some point. So used in that sense, that's fine, but it's good to be aware that Direct3D uses the word resources to mean something quite specific, buffers and textures, and there's even an iResource interface in Direct3D. So I didn't really want to use resources in this kind of more general sense. So I don't use the term resources unless I'm talking about a D3D sense of the word resource. This particular function is another example. And by the way, this whole class is called device resources, so they're using that in a kind of general sense. This function is called create window size dependent resources. You call it every time the window size changes. You have to call it other times though, so it's not just size. So I took that, I kind of just generalized it up a bit in my stuff. So let's talk about some concepts that you'll hear me talk about and you'll see in the code and in the APIs and what have you. So the device, or D3D device, is the way you program the display adapter itself, the actual graphics card. The device context is the way you program the rendering pipeline, and there's a whole bunch of stages in there that I'll talk about at some point. Resources, this is what I was saying about D3D uses the term resources as the kind of general term for buffers and textures. And you actually, in order to acquire or get hold of a resource, you get it from the device. So you call a method on the device, get yourself back a resource, and then you attach that resource into the pipeline, into the rendering pipeline through the device context. The swap chain is a set of frame buffers, usually 2 frame buffers, a back and a front, and you render into the back buffer, and then when you call present, the back buffer and the front buffer are swapped, and the front buffer is always being shown to the user, and it's being shown through the window. So you attach the swap chain to a window, and that's how the pixels get on the screen. So let's talk about the setup code. Now that we've looked at some concepts, talk about the setup code that you have to, or rather the setup work. Let's first of all think about the setup work that you have to do. So there's a bunch of work you have to do that is independent of the device. So that's the grey box on the left. So you can just call that, you can just do that work once. And then there's a bunch of work you have to do that actually depends on certain properties of the device. And if those properties change, then you have to do that work again. And so the device dependent side is actually broken down really into these 2 bits of work. So it's stuff that's independent of features of properties of the window, and then stuff that is dependent on properties of the window. So obviously, if something about the device changes but it's not something about the window, then you can just have to run that leftmost blue box. And if it's stuff that's dependent on the device, and in fact it's actually some property of the window has changed, then you have to run the blue box on the right. So those 3 small boxes each map to a function that you have to call at various times. Like I say, device independent, usually just call it once. Window independent, call it if something about the device changes. Window dependent, call it if something about the window changes. So let's just take a look in this video about that grey box on the left. Look at the function that maps to, the device independent, in my own code. So I call my function do device independent setup. There's only like a page full of code in this function, and there's nothing specifically about Direct3D here. This is setting up some Direct2D factories. Let's take a quick walk through it, and you'll see what I mean. So first of all, we say by default we don't want D3D debugging, but however, if we are building in debug mode, then we actually do turn on that D3D debugging. This is really handy, both D2D and D3D debugging. When that's turned on, and you're running under the debugger, if anything goes wrong, you'll get a message printed out to the output window, which is pretty good. So then we move on to creating these 3 factories, and these are not dependent on the device, so that's why we can create them here in this one function. So here we create a D2D factory. We use that to get the D2D device, and we can also use it to get the DPI for desktop apps, but not for Windows Store apps. We have to call something else to get that. Next, we create a DWrite factory, or a DirectWrite factory, and that's used for font, managing fonts, creating fonts. And then lastly, we initialize the WIC imaging factory, and this is great for encoding and decoding bitmap files, for example. So that's that very simple first device independent bit of setup, and then in the next 2 videos we'll look at each of the 2 device dependent boxes and see how they map to the actual code in a function.